In this video, we're going to talk about what makes a good risk assessment. And I'd like to give you a little bit of background to the material that you're going to see in this particular video. Back in the 1990s, when I began to teach risk assessment courses, I had the opportunity to spend a week with people. And on Friday, I always tried to assemble a panel of risk assessors. When they would meet with us, I would always ask them the same question: what makes a good risk assessment? And I would have 3 or 4 practitioners hold forth and give us their advice. I sat in the back of the class and I began to take notes. And after I had about 200 points or so, I began to put them into groups and categories. And so what you're going to see is really the collected wisdom of many dozens of risk assessors. I wish I could give them proper attribution, but to be honest, I never really envisioned when I started taking notes that one day I would be summarizing that information for others. I thought it was for my own edification, but now it's for yours as well. Number one thing about a good risk assessment is it gets the question right. It's absolutely essential that you understand the decision context that you are conducting your risk assessment for. The questions that the risk assessments are to answer should be written down and known to everyone who's working on the assessment. It's important not to rig the game. If you know what you want to do, don't bother to do a risk assessment. Just go ahead and do what you're going to do. Good risk assessment answers the question clearly and concisely. Not surprisingly, there's a little bit of confusion about the question. So let's talk a little bit about the hierarchy of questions, actually. When we're doing a risk assessment, it's because there's some grand decision to be made. That's that QI level that you see at the very top of this little chart. And then there are questions that should be answered by the risk assessment. Q1, Q2, Q3. These would come from the risk managers, asking for the information that they need to make the decision that needs to be made. For each question that the risk managers ask, the risk assessment team, the risk assessors, will have many, many other questions that they're going to need to answer. So under Q1, the risk assessment team will be asking the QA, QB kinds of questions. These are the tasks of risk assessment, the kinds of questions that you have to answer and get down into the nitty-gritty details. If you look at the bottom of this chart, there's a QI, QII, QIII. These are the curiosities that people have. These are the things that people wonder about and would like to know. But these are also the things that are really not part of a risk assessment at all. So when we talk about getting the question right, it really means all of these things. The second most important thing about good risk assessment is the team. Good risk assessment is a team sport. You need subject matter experts, people who really know the disciplines that are necessary to answer the questions that are being asked. People have to play effective roles. You need leaders, you need researchers, you need data crunchers, you need skeptics, you need people who can play all of those roles. You need good writers and good communicators. Good teams are multidisciplinary. Good risk assessment is interdisciplinary. If you've been following along in the course, you'd know now we go that even one better and say good risk assessment would be transdisciplinary. Teams work collaboratively. Good risk assessment is a collaborative effort. It is not a bunch of individuals all do their parts and then you staple all the papers together and call it a risk assessment. The team is responsible for answering the questions. Although the experts had no problem identifying the question and the team as the two most important aspects of a good risk assessment, the rest of these items are in a rather random order. So let's begin with the magnitude of the effort. The amount of effort that you put into a risk assessment has to be commensurate with the resources that are available. A big budget's going to be a big risk assessment. A small budget will be a small risk assessment. And hopefully the resources are in proportion to the problem, the significance of the problem. The magnitude of the effort, whatever it is, large or small, has to end up reflecting the level of risk. So when there's high risk, there would be more effort, presumably. When there's low risk, less effort. What's important is the process. We know the result is going to be reflecting uncertainty. And so having a good process is important because often we learn a great deal about our problems and their potential solutions in the course of the process. So the data that you identify, the way you gather it, the way you organize it, the analysis that you do, these are all as important as that final ranking, whether it's high risk or a quantitative ranking of a risk, whatever it is. The magnitude of the effort ultimately has to be sufficient to answer the questions that have been posed for you by risk managers. You don't need to do more than that. The point of view of the risk assessment is a topic that would come up often, but always in the context that a risk assessment has no point of view. It should yield the same answer regardless of who is sponsoring the work. If the evidence is the evidence and the method is the method, then no matter who is doing it, the answers should be relatively similar. So answers to questions never reflect a point of view. You're never conservative. You're never liberal. The questions might reflect a point of view, but you answer them as objectively as possible. A risk assessment is not for the assessors to pursue their curiosity or a known answer. If you know what you want to do, if you know what the answer is, don't do a risk assessment. And also, risk assessment does not include value judgments. That falls within the purview of the risk managers. Science is a critical aspect of good risk assessment, but good risk assessment is not science, if for no other reason than because of the uncertainty that persists. But good risk assessment gets the right science focused into the assessment, and it gets that science right. So risk assessment separates what we know from what we do not know. It makes decisions based on what we know as far as is possible. But it also pays attention to those things that we don't know that could affect the decision. When assumptions are made, they are made clear so that risk managers and others can know what those assumptions are. So that means there are no default assumptions. You don't always assume a conservative value or a liberal value. Science is there to provide the basis for answers to all the questions. Back in the 90s, many people differentiated science from data. I'm not so sure that would happen today. We like to talk about evidence, with evidence being inclusive of science and data. But everyone agreed that to do good risk assessment, you need good science, you need good data, you need good models. They don't have to be quantitative models, but they need to be good models. You want to always use the best evidence available and make sure that your analysis is tied to the evidence. It's not enough to gather the data and then go and do what you want. You gather the data and use the data in your analysis. The validity of the data is important. It's also important to understand that data don't have to be quantitative. Data themselves are not information. You have to get the information from the data, and that means using good analytical techniques. The answers to the questions stand or fall on the quality of the data. Uncertainty is a critical part of good risk assessment. You need to recognize it, identify it, say what it is that's uncertain, describe the extent of that uncertainty, and then address it to the extent that you can. Doing uncertainty analysis is one of the strengths of good risk assessment. It is not a weakness, but it wasn't so terribly long ago that to admit that we don't know something was perceived as a weakness. So good risk assessment addresses uncertainty in input variables. Good risk management addresses uncertainty in output variables. Some sort of sensitivity analysis absolutely has to be part of every risk assessment that you ever do. So sensitivity analysis is table stakes. Sensitivity analysis is where you test the sensitivity of the results of your assessment to changes in assumptions that you made to try to bridge uncertainties. When you use scenarios, they have to reflect reality, and then you can test alternative scenarios. The sensitivity analysis, the scenarios, they need to be based on science and field experience. What you are after is understanding how the answers to the questions that the risk managers have posed to you might change if inputs to the risk assessment change. Inputs including assumptions or quantitative variables, for example, that may be uncertain. So sensitivity analysis has to be part of your risk assessment. Even 20 years ago, the experts were saying you have to focus on the relevant risk. Risk is everywhere. Zero risk is not an option for us personally or professionally. Risk assessment is not a safety analysis. It's not the precautionary principle. Risk assessment is focusing on risks that are of interest to decision makers. Residual risks are likely to be important. Transformed risks are likely to be important. Good risk assessment considers explicit and implicit risks relevant to the question. This is very important. Sometimes we focus narrowly on one risk and don't realize that when you push down on one risk, another risk is popping up somewhere. Sometimes we fail to realize that our risk mitigation measures create new risks. So make sure that you have identified all of the relevant risks, even if the risk managers aren't initially aware of them. Listening to the experts, I began to acquire a list of qualities that didn't seem to fit anywhere else except as a list of qualities. So risk assessment, to be good, needs to be unbiased and objective. It needs to tell the truth. Transparency is extremely important. People need to understand what you did and why you did it. A risk assessment should be simple, practical, and logical. On the other hand, it needs to be comprehensive while remaining concise, clear, and consistent. Above all, perhaps, it needs to be relevant. And relevant means it answers the questions. The results of good risk assessment are a little bit like world peace. Everybody wants it. No one knows exactly what it looks like or how to achieve it. But we can at least say good risk assessment meets the risk manager's needs for decision making. So the primary goal of risk assessment is to provide risk managers with the information that they need to make decisions. Keep in mind that the results of a risk assessment are an estimate. They are not facts. They are not facts because this is not science. And this is not science for many reasons, but one of those is because of the uncertainty that exists. So the results of a risk assessment are a tool to be used in making decisions. They are not an answer to a problem or a decision in themselves. You may have more than one audience for a risk assessment. There may be more than one risk manager. So the results may need to be different for each of these audiences. Good risk assessment needs to be independent and independently evaluated. Let's begin with independence. Risk assessment needs to be functionally separated from risk management. Risk managers ask good questions, they can monitor the process, but otherwise it's hands off. Let the risk assessors do the work, let them tell the truth, let the evidence speak. A good risk assessment evaluates its own assumptions and judgments. It discusses the uncertainty. It discusses the assessor's confidence. Good risk assessment is open to evaluation, and that evaluation may include a peer review process. Good risk assessment has to be flexible enough to change, because if it's subjected to this peer review, there's some likelihood that they will find ways to improve the assessment, and the risk assessment has to be open to that change. A good risk assessment process has educational value, in part because it identifies the limits of our knowledge. When we separate what we know from what we don't know, that can be very illuminating. It also enables us at times to direct resources to narrowing the information gaps. Good risk assessment can be used to direct research. A good risk assessment should be simple, but not too simple. What we would like is something that's conducive to learning. A good process helps us to learn about the questions, and a good risk assessment is often helpful to other risk assessors when they are extrapolating from the work done by others. A good risk assessment is documented. The best risk assessments tell a good story well. They consist of a narrative with an engaging beginning, an interesting middle, and a satisfying ending, literally a story rather than a report. Good risk assessment should be explained in simple terms that are readable. The best risk assessments are clear and easy to understand. Some things you're going to have to spell out, but other details can be put into appendices. The principal outcome of a documented risk assessment is answers to the risk manager's questions that are laid out clearly, well, simply, and completely. So here's a summary to good risk assessment. You've got to get the question right. Good risk assessment is a team sport. The effort should match the importance of the risk. There is no point of view in good risk assessment. It's honest and objective. It's based on science, and it identifies all of its assumptions. It uses the best data, and then it addresses uncertainty in a clear, direct fashion. Because there is uncertainty, sensitivity analysis is part of every risk assessment. Risk assessments will not necessarily focus on a single risk. They need to look at all the relevant risks, all the risks relevant to a decision problem. There are desirable qualities of a good risk assessment. Transparency is one of the chief among them, but being objective and telling the truth may be the most important. The results of a risk assessment are estimates. They are not a truth. So they should be open to evaluation by others. The best risk assessments will have some educational value. We'll learn about problems. We'll learn about effective ways to assess risks. And finally, it should all be documented. Even though this guidance is now 20 years or more old, it's still relevant to risk assessment today.